one place I tend to start with this discussion, and there are many places that we could start, but it's with something that I think degrowth sees as really central and important, and that's me. The reason I say me is because I'm in this income group, this median income group of around 75, this is US dollars, 75,000 US dollars. It's an income which equates to an impact, about 11 global hectares of impact, which if everyone in the world, 8 billion people, were to live, would need about 7 planets. Now, the richest 10% is a place that I tend to really focus most of my interests in degrowth. This median 75,000, really, if you earn around 40,000, you're at the beginning of this 10%. The 75,000, this addresses the outliers like billionaires, of which there's only 2,500 billionaires in the world. But so to address these outliers, we go to the median, the middle point of around $75,000. Now that's probably most of us. But I'm not here to blame myself or anyone else in this room. As I was in the introduction, it was said, I'm here to talk about structural impediments to degrowth. This is an income, you need this and more to survive in today's world. And the key structural impediment I'm going to talk to today, which I'll get to later, because we're only just doing short 5-minute little discussions, will be around land. It was a really interesting introduction that Baumann gave around the mode of operation that Indigenous people lived for tens of thousands of years before we came along with market economy. This is the juxtaposition I'd like to set up. Capitalism began with the enclosure of land. The first privatisation, before we were talking about the enclosures, the privatisation of schools or hospitals, was the privatisation of land, something called the enclosures, that happened between the 15th and 18th century primarily. We now live in a situation where that enclosure is so extreme that you and I we're forced into markets to survive, to pay for land and housing. So I'm going to get to that. I'll just ask you to bring up the next stage of this. The reason I put this lifestyle at the very centre is because there are huge implications, obviously, for industry. This lifestyle demands certain jobs and incomes and tax and revenue. We own, of course, we are the investors, this group, this 75,000 group, we are the investors in most of the stock market. We own most of the stock market globally. And of course, the industry produces the consumerism that we live. So the way I tend to like to address this issue is that we are at the centre of the degrowth problem, and that government and industry really are something we shouldn't personify too much. They're like a mirror of the way we live. Now this, again, I'll say, isn't to blame myself or anyone else. I think there's a structural lock-in, which I'll get to later, and I briefly just mentioned. I'll just bring up the next side of this. Government are also someone we like to point our finger at, but of course there's a structural lock-in there too, isn't there? Industry, infrastructure, they provide the industry infrastructure for this lifestyle that we live. The policy, the financial and the physical infrastructure is provided by government. Sometimes we hold out hope for a new saviour, like happened in 2015 with the Trudeau government. We thought there would be great climate policy would come into place. It just so happened that was a big letdown, wasn't it? Recently, he's been called by climate activists, a villain because of this gas pipeline, one of the biggest in the world, that he's now approved. Why is he doing this? Well, he's providing the energy infrastructure for the lifestyle that we all demand. Not only demand, because it's not cultural, we structurally need it to survive because of this current mode of operation, which is a market mode of operation, which essentially goes down to the foundation of our market system, which is the privatisation of land, and I'll speak to that a bit later. Of course, the militarised resource security is the responsibility of government too. Another area we tend to like to point our finger at and say huge amounts of carbon, but what's it protecting? Well, essentially it's protecting the lifestyles we all lead, the resource grabbing that the top 10% of us are all involved in. And of course it also provides a cover of liberal democratic legitimacy, doesn't it? We like to think we are the great arbiters of human rights and so on in the developed, in the global north. So this is pretense. But of course, it also produces incredible amount of this resource grabbing historically through colonisation and now through incredible forms of debt, produces the poorest 50% of the world's people who are have a median income of around $3,000 per year. And of course they are nowhere near as responsible for the environmental destruction that was opened with by Tommy. It's us living these $75,000 lifestyles that are requiring 7 Earths, and there are huge implications industry and government-wise from that lifestyle. Just quickly to the next slide. Jason Hickel has produced this incredible study, the Sustainable Development Index, and what he's telling us is that the maximum threshold for gross national income per capita is about $20,000. Because he's done this incredible exercise of equating income to resource impact, something that Oxfam, the UN Emissions Gap Report, and another body, which I can't think of the name, has done a very good job demonstrating, just as you'll see graphs today probably showing how GDP is in a similar line with economic environmental impact or ecological impact, material footprint and carbon emissions. You'll see that the graph goes in the same direction. Guess what? So do our incomes on a personal basis. Our incomes also go up with environmental impact, both carbon emissions and material footprint. So what is Jason Hickel telling us? That we need to contract, to degrowth our personal income to about 20,000, which is adjusted across nations by this purchasing price index that he set up. He says anything higher violates two indicators of ecological impact: CO2 emission and material footprint. How the hell do we live on this kind of money? And that's the question that I'm going to be exploring a little bit today when I'm looking at the housing issue. I think that, I'll again speak to a slide. I might move on from this actually, Tommy, because the conversation's moved on. These are here. Okay, back on here, yeah. Erin's just shown us another fantastic graph, the champagne glass graph, which again illustrated the 10% issue, which I really think is at the heart of the degrowth challenge. If this 10%, as Oxfam have just recently told us, which is us, we are in the median of that 10%. If we are producing 52% of global carbon and using 11 hectares for our lifestyle, how do we contract that lifestyle? I think there's a structural lock-in here. Again, Erin mentioned something really important here, which is the de-enclosure. How do we get off this economic growth treadmill? How do I get off it? I'm a sustainability academic. My income, which I need to pay my home, comes from commodities. HEX is all funded largely through commodities, and flying international students who have huge carbon footprints. And I'm a degrowth academic. So, why do I need this income? How do I get off that? Well, if we go to the next slide, to get off that and live a degrowth lifestyle, and the next bit, you must first secure land. And this is, I would argue, and the position I'd like to take on this is that this is at the heart of the challenge. If we do believe that we need to move into a post-growth era, that's really fundamental, isn't it, to this capitalist system that we live in. Growth is inherent to this market system. So how on earth can we contract economy? We saw during COVID a contraction of economy. We saw 60,000 tourist workers in Australia out of work for quite a period of time. What were they immediately in? They were immediately in housing crisis. It looks good from a degrowth perspective. For the first time in many, many years, our carbon emissions went into contraction, but we had a social crisis. So how do we have the sort of soft landing that we're talking about, that we don't go into recession and depression and have people in economic hardship? Well, we must find alternative housing options, alternative ways of life. There is another mode of economic operation that preceded market capitalism, obviously, and Indigenous communities, including all of our Indigenous communities, our pre-market economies. The oldest economy is local collaboration on public land or commons. This is the oldest, and to this day, believe it or not, the most widespread form of economic settlement. Could we balance the fantastic innovation of markets with the reclaiming or the de-enclosure of economy? Could we reintroduce this type of economy that gives us back commons and gives us back our labour, because we're free from markets? I mean, imagine if you were free from housing debt. Could your food production and things like that suddenly become this sort of local and community-based phenomenon that so many in degrowth are encouraging us towards? Up where I live in the Blue Mountains, we had a community garden begin. We had hundreds of people turn up at the open day, but only a few people continue to inhabit that garden. I tell you why. Fundamentally, it's because we're pulled into the market economy very structurally, and these days more than ever with the housing crisis, we are pulled powerfully back into markets. This is a structural impediment. There's one more bit to this slide. You must secure land, putting you where? Right back on where I am in my degrowth job at the university, back on the mill, putting me into that top 10%, and meaning that I live a 11 hectare lifestyle, which if everyone lived, we'd need 7 more planets. There is one more slide for a bit of hope. I would like to just very briefly make reference to, also this is just a bit of a sequence, we can rush through this because I know I've used too much time. So of course the enclosure of commons was the initiator, what Marx called primitive accumulation. The enclosure of land really launched markets. The enclosure of the privatisation of the mediums of production for profit stands at the very central tenet of capitalism, doesn't it? To this day, our reliance on these markets to pay for food and housing has now become unsustainable. But yet, any government who dares challenge growth will be out on their ass in 5 seconds flat. Why? Because we all rely on this growth. At the recent COP meetings, the last one, scientists presented information that would scare the pants off anyone about what's happening in climate change, but their constituents at home were demanding the response to the inflation crisis, the response to the slowing of growth. They will be out tomorrow if they don't produce growth. Why? Fundamentally, because who are we? We're this guy. Our security depends on growth markets until we can restore commons, decommodify, as Aaron says, the basis of our survival. And so I'm looking for ways degrowth can provide new paths, and the last slide talks to that. This talks to 2 modes of economic operation, the Indigenous, the decolonisation of our markets. There's at least these 2 modes of economic operation out there. If we want to decolonise, isn't freeing land for markets fundamental to that decolonisation process? And lastly, the example of Vienna, which the Greens have now been talking about. In fact, they held up the housing bill in the Senate talking about Vienna, because Vienna's kept the nationalisation of land and housing, hasn't it? These are at-cost rental properties that drastically reduce the need of people in Vienna for income, because their rents are tied to their earnings, 25%. Could this sort of opportunity, and we're in a housing crisis, we're looking for new options, aren't we? Could these sorts of opportunities give us the sort of degrowth, contraction of economy that Hickel is asking us for, where we move from the $75,000 income down to the $20,000 income and contract our global hectares per person down to the 1.6 that Degrowth says is required of all of us. The 1.6 hectares that 8 billion people could have access to, with roughly equivalent to this 20,000 annual income. It is housing, and Vienna and Singapore present very interesting case studies in this type of alternative structural arrangement. Politically, there's momentum building for this because we are in a housing crisis and things will not get better, as everyone is telling us. The trajectory is not good without a decommodification or a reversal of enclosures. So I would love to see Degrowth get behind the public housing movement. That's my main spiel. Social housing has earned the reputation, hasn't it, in Australia of being associated with welfare dependence. So it can be hard for many of us to have this conversation, can't it? However, its heritage, as I've tried to explain before, is much, much deeper than welfare. Can I just bring up one of those slides? Its heritage is in our Indigenous past. It's in our pre-market. My particular heritage is Central European and pre-markets. The commons and the localisation of economy were as important there as they were here in Indigenous cultures. We go back a few slides here. Sorry, go forward. Yeah. Look, as has been discussed really well here by Gareth and others, there are many capitalist responses to the capitalist problems of growth, and they're all important. I'm not going to argue against any of them. But it started, a few of them are being debunked right now, aren't they? Things like carbon credits are in major trouble, but there's many attempts to green our market economies, and we will need to keep attempts at those. But there's something much more fundamental that will be required to achieve the sort of degrowth that people like Jason Hickel are telling us will be needed. It's a drastic form of degrowth. If we are going to live in countries like Australia and states in Europe, if we're going to contract economies so drastically, and the recent UN emissions gap report has told us we need to move from about 20 tonnes of carbon production per capita per person to 2.1. 10-fold contraction and equivalent material footprint as well. 10-fold contraction. That's not going to happen through carbon credits. It could happen if we opened up or decolonised the economy. Not to say market economy isn't important. It is important. It produces wonderful innovation, and there will always be an element of market economy. But we must restore or decolonise pre-market economies. This really goes to this alternative economic space that we need to re-acknowledge. The World Bank is very famous for being very one-eyed in its view of development. It's only capitalist development. And social housing, going to the question, Tommy, is core, or public housing rather than social housing. Social housing actually represents an enclosure in itself in the attempt to pass public forms of housing over to non-profit and away from government providers. Public housing could actually be the structure that most developing countries have that re-allows a restoring of commons. Already in public housing communities, there's programs called tenant participation programs where tenants are involved in things like community gardens, resource sharing, social events. They're already doing this old form of economy, which is local collaboration on public land. Guess what their income is in many of these unemployed communities? It is around $20,000. They're already living on what Hickel is suggesting us to live on and supplementing those lifestyles through programs like this. We have a model of degrowth in public housing. People living on what Hickel says in terms of income, so they're at about 1.5 hectares of material footprint, and they're locally collaborating on common land. They have effectively decolonised their development. Now that we're in a housing crisis, we are desperately looking for alternatives. What's the mood around housing at the moment? It's a mood of no answers and crisis, isn't it? And all we're hearing is the trajectory is getting worse. A model like this could actually gain political momentum. particularly because it's taking a lot of dependency out of public housing. People, even in the UK, there's housing projects where people are getting involved in the building of the housing themselves and taking away the cost. And in Vienna, it's even at the point where there's many that are running at cost, meaning if you take developers and banks and landlords out of the equation, these things don't happen at cost to taxpayers. They happen at cost, and people can do it for around 20,000. But it can only happen, that fundamental shift to de-commodify markets is through the reclaiming of land. Land is not a product of markets. Land is not a product of states. Land, like air and water, is fundamental to all of our survival. The reclaiming of it, if we want to move towards degrowth, there must be a reclaiming of it. Growth began with the enclosure of land. How on earth is it going to end until we decommodify it? This is the cycle. The loop has to be closed. Of course, there will be the sorts of greening of markets, everything from UBI, where you try to give people a whole bunch of money. But if the cost of land goes up, well, the UBI better go up, and industry better keep paying its revenue. So you better have the Apples of the world paying huge amounts of money. So if we're gonna go in the direction of monetary systems, well, we will. And capitalist systems produce innovations, I wouldn't deny it. But we must balance that innovation. We're about to innovate ourselves to death, folks. We need alternative economic spaces. The oldest and most widespread alternative economic space is commons, Indigenous to all of us, commons. So it's a decolonisation that degrowth fundamentally depends on. Social housing, or public forms of housing rather, can be central to that process. And the Greens are talking about the Vienna model. There's a really good article going around at the moment from the housing spokesman, Max Chandler from the Greens, talking about the Vienna model. And I'd love Degrowth to get involved in that conversation, because I think it's really core to creating that new foundation for degrowth. Take on this, I think that we often talk about cultural shift in degrowth, just the knowledge that better lives can be had through reduced material access. To me, that belies the fact. And the fact is that we and our children more than ever are locked into markets and must perform in those markets at ever-growing rates to survive and put a simple roof over our heads. So to me, the core, a very foundational issue, a structural issue is the land issue. And I'd encourage an investigation of that. I think the resistance we get to degrowth, the reason it's rubbish, is people say, you are joking. You are talking about contracting economy when people need economy now more than ever to afford the roof over their head. It's a poison pill, degrowth, until you resolve the path. You must give people back a path to their livelihoods, to putting a roof over their head, to security that does not require economic growth. That's my take on it. So I encourage a sort of a meditation on the foundations of our market system, which is enclosure, and what systems, what processes could we embark on in our lives. And I think getting behind public housing is a strategy that I'm feeling pretty good about. And it's the talk at the moment anyway. It's where we're at in terms of the housing crisis. Imagine if we could liberate it from its dependency neoliberal narrative and bring it back to the decolonisation of land and of our economy, of localising it through commons. That's a really powerful story. It's a new story, as George Monbiot tells us to find. It's a new story coming from a very old story, a pre-market story. What would it look like in a modern urban context? Well, I think Vienna's giving us some ideas, and I think that's what I encourage. As you say, something that is really confined to what we need to do in the global north. So in a way, it's a remedy, not a story, isn't it? The biggest story, and I think people are really struggling with that story in a time of perceived difficulty, when people are in the microcosm having to pay for the roof over their head, and that's an immediate personal challenge that many Australians are facing. an immediate personal constriction. The idea of degrowth, that we should be contracting in the context of the pressure that people feel. I mean, the climate challenge and ecological collapse, can feel quite depersonal compared to the personal challenge of the rent or the mortgage and keeping a roof over your children's head. That's the immediate personal challenge. So where do we meet that person with the degrowth story? I think it's counterintuitive to that person because they're looking for more income so that they can be secure. They're looking for greater economy, greater opportunity, because they're a precarious class, aren't they? They're living paycheck to paycheck. So they need more, not less. But the alternative story, which I think has much more intuitive power, is the decolonisation story. Probably not that term either, but the story that all of our pre-market heritage, whether it's a European pre-market heritage or an Australian First Nation pre-market heritage or a Middle Eastern pre-market heritage, that all of us have stories told to us by our parents and by our grandparents of a commons. That story, reimagining that heritage and imagining what it could be in the future. To me, there's a story in there somewhere. Now, I haven't probably named that story very well, but that's the story that I'm trying to tell. I don't know how well it answers your question. I know there's a lot of concern about degrowth and its inability as a story, that it's a contraction, that it's a remedy, that it's not a story. I know there's that concern around at the moment. I'm looking for the alternative story in the alternative economic space. I haven't found them. I'm looking for artists and musicians and storytellers to help me in my very clunky process of trying to get my head around this. I just wanted to really quickly qualify my MMT comment too, and just to say that, look, I'm sure there's a place for modern monetary theory and the UBI and all of these qualifications of market economy. But this alternative story I'm trying to tell is what fundamental alternative economic story could we tell? Not a qualification of monetary systems, giving people more money for free so they can afford a home. That, to me, is probably something that's going to happen, and it's always happening. But there is something far more fundamental that needs to take place if we're going to have anything like the level of degrowth that's being called for. Something that could help complement market economies, something that will respond to the housing crisis. To me, that is a reclaiming, a decolonisation of land.
Want to talk to